Let me make sure that we've got things going on. Facebook. Looks like we're good. Once again, it appears that the technology is working without any fiddling. But it can't be true. There must be something that is going dramatically wrong. And you know what the other weird thing is? It seems like every time right when I'm about to start, maybe it's my smile triggers it or something, but my eyelid starts spasming. So if you see my eye doing weird things, I don't know what's going on there. I was out of town last week. I was on spring break with my family. We went out of town to visit some family in Arizona, and it was a fantastic trip. So I missed last Thursday, but I'm back today. And 2 weeks ago, I did kind of a discussion on focal point, and I'm going to dig a little bit more into that idea today, specifically, as I often do, kind of contradicting myself or finding examples of artwork that contradict some of what I said. Art and creativity and humanity is such a messy, large mass of potentials and needs and expectations and all these things that it's hard to make definitive statements without it being the exact opposite in other situations, right? Anyway, I feel like it's healthy to see counterexamples to the kinds of things that I was talking about last time in terms of focal point. Before I get to that, my Resin Techniques class is over as of last week. It was a fantastic class. It was my third 5-week-long art class. I did a raw materials class, then I did a mixed media class, and then this most recent was a focus on epoxy resin. What I'm realizing is that this format of working in 5-week increments is probably, it's just not a very sustainable way for me to deliver instruction. So I've been thinking a lot about how that might change. I am planning on making the resin course a standalone video series that you can access and purchase at dabbleon.com. That will be coming soon. I do have a color mixing course that has been perpetually almost done for the past many months. That should be available for purchase at dabbleon.com as well. So I'm also considering having these standalone classes like the resin class, but then also offering, and I don't know what I'd call it. It would be an office hours or a lab of some kind where there would be a live Zoom meeting where you could come and ask questions about what you see in the videos, or how questions about how the information that I give in the videos is applicable to your specific situation. So a lot of the benefit of the classes that I've been teaching in these 5-week increments, a lot of the benefit is the interaction. I can teach things, but sometimes it can be difficult to make the jump from the instruction to application to your specific, project or your vision. So I want to have some way to offer that to you, because I think that's an important part. Another important part is the community aspect of these classes, and being inspired by other people that are attempting the same techniques that you're learning in the class. Seeing their idea and their work process, and all of that can be very motivating and inspiring. So I'm also thinking coming up with a lot of different ideas of how I can continue that as well. So the private Facebook group is a good way to do that, but I believe there might be other ways, including critique groups. which has been something that I've been batting around for a long time. I just haven't found the right way to organize that or administer those groups, but that is coming soon. Please keep track or keep checking on Davalon.com. Or if you are interested in any of these ideas or any of these products that I'm talking about, art classes about resin, about mixed media, about painting, drawing, digital media, make sure you sign up for my email newsletter, which is at Davalon.com. I am aware that my website is a little bit unfriendly. It's not very well organized at the moment. That should change hopefully very soon. But this has been a learning process. So there are a lot of things that are going on, and hopefully I'll have more information about some of these things very soon. But I'd love for you to be involved, and I'd love for you to participate in any way that you would like. I'd love to create a more accessible option for those of you that don't want to take or commit to a longer course or don't have the financial means to pay for a 5-week commitment type of course. So keep watching, and then I will continue also to obviously have these Thursday live broadcasts that will remain free. I would love it if more people would participate in these live broadcasts. I know that it's daunting to submit your own work, especially work that's in progress or recently finished, because it is a vulnerable situation to put yourself out there and to share things that perhaps are still you're not very confident about. So I understand why perhaps you'd be hesitant to share your artwork, but that is the hope that ultimately that I will get more submissions for these live broadcast critiques, and I hope that is the case. So if you are new to this broadcast, I welcome any submissions of your artwork that I can discuss and critique here on this broadcast. It doesn't have to be completed work. It can be work in progress. If there are specific things that you would like me to cover or discuss or respond to or give you ideas on, you can include that in your email. Or you can just submit the images and see what I say, and that can be a very valuable bit of information just to see how your work is functioning regardless of what you think it's doing, right? So sometimes there's too big of a gap between the way we want something to work and what we want it to communicate and then what it is actually doing. So I am hoping that this broadcast is a resource for those of you that would like that kind of instruction as well. So again, to return, a couple weeks ago, my last live broadcast, I talked about focal point. Focal point is, as a teacher, as an art teacher, it is something that I continually come back to, and is a pretty major sticking point for a lot of artists. And keep in mind that I'm talking about artists that are in a specific context, and that context is making paintings, usually to hang on a gallery wall, right? So decorative paintings that are meant to be engaged with, meant to challenge or inspire or to beautify, that are meant to stand on their own as objects. And most artists that are making these images would like their audience to appreciate what they're doing, to not just look once and be done with it, but to enter in, to contemplate, to spend some time with it, right? So with that, those kinds of values or assumptions or expectations or motivations in mind, focal point becomes a very important property or a very important element. Is it an element or a principle? I guess it might be. Oh, goodness. It's been too long since I've taught that a design class. But focal point becomes very important. Focal point, it essentially it's that initial hook that we have with our audience. It helps the audience connect with the work initially, so they know what they're supposed to be looking at. If they don't know what they're supposed to be looking at, just imagine yourself. If you don't know what you're supposed to be looking at, it's very hard to engage with something. You find yourself just kind of staring around, searching for the point, searching for what it is that you're supposed to be getting from this experience. So focal point's a very important thing. And then secondary and tertiary focal points help us move throughout an image and see, a hierarchy of meaning, perhaps, or a way to that we're supposed to engage in some kind of narrative way or incremental way as we move throughout an image. So focal point is a very important idea and an important thing to be aware of in the context of studio art, of visual art. We've got to understand it. We got to understand how to create focal point, and then we got to understand focal point because we don't want to unintentionally create focal points that distract somebody, that grab attention in a way that we don't intend, right? So we got to really understand and keep track of focal point. So that's more or less kind of what I was talking about 2 weeks ago. A counterpoint to that there are some artists who do not have focal point at all. Some very famous artists who don't really have focal point, or not really a primary focal point. Maybe they have some areas of higher emphasis, but not strong enough necessarily to be a dominant focal point, right? One of those artists who is obvious, who's an obvious example of that, is Jackson Pollock. So he's the one that I wanted to kind of focus on today, and there are some others that I'll bring up along these lines. But I'm going to switch over here to my computer screen, and I've done just an image search for Jackson Pollock, and there he is. So looking across the screen, it's a fantastic mess, right? That's kind of the. Let's take a look at something here and more. Let's see what this is going to do. Let me do this. Open image in new tab, and let me zoom in on that. Okay, so this is a pretty good example. Standard Jackson Pollock, something that you'd expect to see. And actually, now that I think of it, what I want to do is take this into Photoshop. So that gives me a little bit of some options to manipulate it. Okay, so here's your standard Jackson Pollock, pretty low resolution image, so we've got a lot of pixelation there. Don't mind that. I don't think it's going to detract from the point I'm trying to make. Where does your eye go? Where are you attracted to first? We tend to be attracted first and foremost by value contrast. Value contrast is light and dark contrast. So these areas up here where we've got big dark spots surrounded by light or white drips, where there's more of that high value contrast, maybe our eyes kind of get caught on that, but that's kind of the metaphor I'd use. They kind of like, it's an irritant. It's something that kind of, that grabs our attention a little bit. But again, in the context of this larger mess, it's not strong enough to really, that we could really say it's a dominant focal point per se. It's just more of kind of an irritant. It's a little, it's trying to pull at us, but it's not really able to retain our attention. The visual information in this case is fairly evenly distributed. It's all of a similar nature. It's drippy, it's line, it's movement, and there's lots of movement. The color contrast being used, you have some yellows and blues, which are kind of contrasty, but it's really mostly neutral. So we don't really have a whole lot of high saturation here. It's mostly neutrals, a little bit of saturation, but again, that saturation is similarly sized and evenly distributed. So it's just this, it's like looking at static on an analog TV. That's a metaphor that's not going to go well perhaps with today's youth, but back in the day when we had tube TVs and there wasn't a clear signal, you'd just get, the snowstorm, where it was just kind of evenly distributed little dots of white, black, and gray, right? So again, we look at this and we're kind of not entirely sure where to go. There's, there's little points that grab our attention, but really it's just this chaos. We're moving around, and to a certain degree, that was the point, right? This was about artist gesture. This was about in the capturing the artist's movements through space, their arm, the paint, as kind of a dance, right? And so I'm not interested really in discussing how his artwork fits into an art theoretical narrative or the narrative of art history and the ideas that are wrapped up, and embodied by these visual images. I'm not really interested in getting into that, the going against Thomas Hart Benton or the ideas of Clement Greenberg, or the art theory stuff is all valid, important stuff. There's a lot of reasons that Jackson Pollock's paintings are important other than the actual paintings themselves, right? It's what he represents, the ideas that he was engaging with, that are also significant. But again, just purely visually, there's not a lot for me to lock in on. So what happens instead? If I don't know where to look in this image, I'm just kind of moving around, right? My eyes just kind of searching for the right place to land. And that's kind of the point, is it's about movement. It's about gesture. I also, instead of locking in on one part of the image and going from there to somewhere else, from a primary to a secondary focal point, instead I tend to engage with the image as a whole, as just one thing, rather than something that I enter in and move around, or enter in and go from here over to here. I tend to just kind of interact with it and perceive it as a single thing, rather than a combination of multiple elements. It's just this, this mess. And again, not necessarily a bad thing, right? And in fact, when you see a Jackson Pollock, part of their appeal is just their scale, their size. They tend to be fairly large, and having something that large and messy is just impressive, right? There's a bodily relationship, and it is this chaotic information, and chaotic information is going to get our mind and our psychology in a mode of being in alert, right? Because chaos is on some level, visual chaos is threatening, right? It's something that requires our attention. We got to be aware of. Needs to be understood, right? So that combination of scale and then just the chaotic nature of this visual information, that alone is enough to evoke a certain amount of awe and a certain amount of engagement, of respect. So and that's kind of how I've always felt about Jackson Pollock's paintings. You go in and it's just like, wow, this is a terrific mess. This is just like in your face chaos, and it's this bodily physical relationship because you're dwarfed by this massive canvas with all this gushy paint. So then focal point kind of becomes irrelevant. It's not really about that, right? So again, this is an example of somebody that contradicts kind of the emphasis I was putting on last week on focal point, that how important it is that we include it. But then let's look at some other examples of his work. So this one right here, and he did a series of these where he's got this, let's see, let me open that up in a new tab. So he did these series, I think the title in there was Blue Poles or something like that. It does not like that file type. So I'm going to circumvent that by doing a screen grab and dropping that in a new file. Okay, so in this case, we do have some variety, right? The visual information isn't so uniform and isn't so evenly distributed. We've got this chaos of information happening in the background that is fairly uniform and evenly distributed, but then we have these lines, these posts. And my Wacom tablet, again, is not very well positioned on the desk for me to be in control. So we've got these lines, these blue posts that disrupt the chaos, right? They're bigger, thicker lines than everything else. There are these concentrations of little knobs of these circular shapes that disrupt those lines, right? So they're big, disruptive lines that are different than everything else. They're positioned at angles. So they're not just up and down or side to side, they're at slight angles that create directional movement and momentum. And they don't extend across the whole composition. There are these little passageways where this chaos can kind of swirl around these lines. But these create focal point, right? In fact, it looks kind of like we've got four focal points now. I would say my eye goes here first, and probably it goes to this post first because it's on the left, and we tend to read images left to right. But this is kind of equally strong in terms of its size in relation to other elements and its contrast. So this would be, maybe a secondary focal point, and I land here first in this line. I go here second, and then maybe I go here third and back to this one fourth. I think that's probably how, just my initial read. So in this case, there's a primary, secondary, tertiary, and quadutiary, fourth focal point, created by these bars, and those are in the larger context of all this chaos. So there is a little bit more for us to read. It's a little bit more legible. We're more apt to not just perceive it as a singular experience or singular visual entity, but rather an accumulation of these four lines in this negative space or this field. In this case, if we take those four lines away, we're in the same boat, right? There's not really enough variety or anything that stands out as dominant over the other things or more emphasized for us to really consider it a focal point. All right. So really in Jackson Pollock's body of work, we have kind of varying degrees of this. So we have examples like this first one that we were looking at where it's basically just chaos, right? There's no real clear focal points. We have this kind where these bars kind of start to create focal point, or are different enough than the background of chaos that they start to create areas of emphasis. And then you have things that are kind of in between those two, like this one, where there's more variety than that first image that we looked at, right? So we do start to get some areas that appear to be high, like bigger drips, an accumulation of bigger drips that create kind of a larger shape or a subsection of the overall composition that is a darker value generally, kind of a circle over here. And then we have this area down here that seems to be a little bit more dense with black. So maybe there's kind of the beginning of a coalescing of a focal point or two in this case. That could be said, and we might start bouncing between those two areas that are starting to be more emphasized, more dominant. But it really doesn't quite get to the point where we have those four blue lines and a very clear focal point. All right, so focal point. You don't have to have it. Primary, secondary, tertiary focal point. There are artists who have successfully gone without clear focal points, and I'll look at a couple more here, a couple more examples. But when we don't have the focal point, again, we tend to perceive or experience or interpret or read these visual images as singular overall objects, right? That just we consume them as a single thing rather than going in. And maybe there's movement, maybe there's pattern and energy there, but it's harder for us to lock in and then go from one area to the other to move throughout the composition. All right, couple other examples of artists who work similarly. So a word for this that I've come across in teaching and in reading, when there is no focal point, a composition is said to be crystallographic, or all over, the whole thing is focal point, right? It's just one thing. Crystallographic. I don't know why I bring that up. I just feel like I need to have a name for things, I think. So that would be the name for a image that does not have a focal point. Crystallographic balance, I think, is also what it's referred to. Okay, an artist who I wanted to bring up in this context of somebody who also has this quality where it's just a mass of information and there is not a very dominant, clear focal point, is Julie Moretu. She's fantastic. I think she blows Jackson Pollock out of the water 100 times over. So much more interesting, so much more engaging, and so much more effective. And she just worked harder. Like, you can tell that she cared more. She was more just sophisticated, more intelligent, more of everything. Julie Moretu hits it out of the park every time. She is fantastic. If you're not familiar with her work, well, let's take a look at some of these images. Open image in new tab. They are similar to Jackson Pollock in that there is just a mass of very energetic visual information. She has a tremendous amount more of variety, right? So she's exploring mark making, different kinds of graphic lines next to scribbled lines, different colors, different media, different directions. There's a sense of architectural structures and a sense of patterns and things that almost coalesce into an environment or a structure of some kind, but they never quite resolve. So it ends up just being this, this chaos of energy. So in this case, looking at her work, there are these patterns that we start to see and directions and the lines here that start to kind of point us maybe to this general area in the center, right? We're kind of, we've got these lines that are almost like linear perspective lines, and this almost feels like a horizon line in the back that kind of lead us back into this space. And also, she has this, the concentration of visual information is more dense around the periphery, around the outside of this composition, and then we have more space here in the center. So it feels like this more concentrated visual information is framing whatever she's leading us back into back here. But again, I mean, like, there's these suggestions of space, there's suggestions of movement and of leading us somewhere. But then we get there and there's really nothing there. It's just empty space. So it never quite resolves into an aha or I get it. And always just kind of keeps us on this level of energy, right? Energy and movement. And keeps us moving around and looking. And the lack of a focal point or a really clear focal point is a feature in this case. It kind of keeps us engaged in this search, right? In this momentum and energy and moving around and the chaos. And I think that's what I love about it. Similar to Jackson Pollock, her work tends to be very large in scale and is very impressive and intimidating and awesome and sublime. It just feels like this force of nature. I love her work, as you can probably tell. I think you can see some of her work at the Broad, downtown LA. I believe they have something at LACMA. I'd be surprised if they didn't. And then obviously in New York, Whitney, she, I'm sure, has been in a biennial somewhere along the line. In fact, I think that's where she kind of initially got attention. Anyway, I don't feel like I need to necessarily go in and discuss many more of these. Similar to Jackson Pollock, so we've got this image right here. Let me see if I can pull that into Photoshop real quick. Oh, much better image. So in this case, there is a very clear concentration of high value right here, a concentration of this dark value in the context of these lighter values in the surrounding area. It creates kind of this bigger shape or subdivision of the composition that could be considered a focal point, like right there, right? It's not very clear as a representational image. It's not very clear as something that we can divine any specific meaning from, but it does create a focal point. So, like Jackson Pollock, Julie Moretu also has a spectrum, right? Some do have kind of senses of stronger focal points, um, but she definitely has a lot of work that definitely pushes against locking in on a specific focal point. Like you can see this one where, again, there's this kind of swirling. There's a vortex there's a center of, but at the center there's nothing, right? So it's framing space, but it resists being landing in a location, right? It resists creating a focal point. In some regards, this area up at the top, because the larger shapes and the just more of the composition is occupied by these saturated colors, that perhaps is a focal point, but it is enough of the composition that, again, I think you'd be hard-pressed to consider that really a point, a focal point. It's maybe an area of emphasis, but not really a focal point. And then the last one, last artist that I wanted to invoke here along these same lines is Rothko. So Mark Rothko is, part of a kind of painting similar to Julie Moretu and Jackson Pollock. His canvases tend to be quite large, so there's this bodily relationship and the physicality of that object and the size of these colored shapes are definitely an important part of the experience. But I guess you could say that these individual shapes, like this red shape down here, I'm looking at this right side of the screen. This red shape is darker than this light shape up at the top and darker than the surrounding yellow. So maybe that stands out as a focal point, and it being a saturated red also makes it a kind of a focal point. But again, it occupies enough of that pictorial space, enough of the compositional space, that I think it'd be hard-pressed to kind of consider that a focal point. And again, more of just kind of a general area of emphasis. And like the other two, he wasn't after, I think, a focal point. I think he wanted the experience to be engaging with this painting as a whole, as a singular monolithic visual experience, as an environment, or as this kind of as a context more than as you trying to find meaning or a narrative or anything like that in the image. It was more kind of just these environments, these kind of general an ambiance, a feeling. Anyway, more so than trying to get you to enter in and move around the composition. And I think it's going to be a short one today. I think that's all I wanted to cover. So again, I think my tendency is to want to, whenever I make a definitive statement or give a a lesson where I am saying something that feels more like a general rule or an absolute rule, my knee-jerk reaction typically is to then the very next lesson try to do something that contradicts my definitive statement. And I think this is just born of my suspicion, my general suspicion of anything that starts to feel like an absolute rule of creation. Creativity is something that's messy. The rules are there, and they're there for good reasons, but there are also good reasons to break them. And we need to understand the rules, and we need to understand that there are consensus ways of communicating, that as human beings, as individual cultures in the world, we have standardized ways of speaking, of communicating to each other and emoting and expressing. But sometimes those standardized ways are the very thing we need to reject and push against to say something more profound or more truthful. And I think that is at the root of my desire to contradict myself. Don't get lazy. Don't rely too much on the rule and let that be the motivating factor. Let you be the motivating factor. Something inside. All right, everybody. Again, keep track of dabbleon.com. I've been kind of taking a break this past few days, which has been kind of nice. I'm not stressing too much about what I'm doing next. I really have had fantastic experiences with these past classes that I've been teaching, but again, trying to find the right framing, find the right way to connect with you all and provide the kinds of experiences and instruction that I would like, and also to make enough money to keep doing it. So more information on that coming very soon. Keep track at dabbleon.com. Sign up for sign up for my email list so you get information as that comes. I also have a new podcast that's coming very, very soon. I've recorded 2 episodes and just need to get them edited. So keep track of that as well. It'll be called Raw Materials. I'm going to be talking to artists about how the materials and techniques they use actually inspire them, that they're not just tools, but they're the actual source of inspiration for what they do. So that's coming soon. And then also a reminder, if you want me to talk about your artwork, not necessarily a lesson. This was kind of like a lesson. If you want me to critique your work, that's what I'm here for. And I would love to take a look at your work and talk about it. If there's something specific you want me to address, then include that in your email. But you can send your images to dabbleon, DABBLEON, at gmail.com. And I will give you credit or say your name or not say your name. I will, if you would like me to inform people of your social media accounts, I can do that as well to give you some exposure, but I can also just do it anonymously. And that is it for today. Thank you everyone for joining. I have not checked in on the Facebook group. I was spending more time just making sure that all the technology was set up right, and hopefully I didn't have the lag today that I had some lag problems last time, but hopefully that wasn't the case today. And let me know what you think, requests, etc., and have a fantastic day. I'll be here again next Thursday at 11 a.m. Send me images. I want to see your work, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.